So, women are now being oppressed by their own achievements. Some women are actually too clever to find a partner. Now, this article isn't that bad. It's just a little too one-dimensional, focusing on educational attainment. So at best, it's an incomplete story. The dating gap. Why the odds are stacked against female graduates finding a like-minded man. Well, if that's the case, then it follows that working-class men will have difficulty finding like-minded females. But you don't see articles written like that because only females can be victims. Haven't you learned this already? Or maybe it's just because females write the articles and men just don't pay that much attention to them. Although the book referred to in this article was written by a man. It's all very confusing. There were, says Kat, perhaps 1 or 2 male students on her English degree. It was the same, she noticed, on her friends' courses. Yeah, and what kind of courses were they? Gender studies? Sociology? There were a lot of girls at my university, she says. You would look around tutorials or lectures and there would be 1 or 2 token guys. While there are some degrees, particularly in science and engineering subjects, that are overwhelmingly filled with male students, the general trend in many countries is for more women to go to university than men. Yes, tell us something we don't know. Again, this could be written from the perspective of guys in STEM fields looking around and noticing the dearth of women. I mean, this could be one of the best selling points to get more women into STEM. Hey, go into STEM and you're more likely to get married. But of course, the feminists will never get on board with that one because they view marriage as a system of white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. How great to have so many clever, educated young women spilling out every year. But there could be negative consequences. As a new book, Datonomics, points out, there may not be enough educated men to go around. And of course, there's an underlying false assumption here that having a university degree makes you intelligent. Now in Australia, and I suspect many other Western countries, we've been lowering the standards to get into university for years. There was an article last year showing that some universities are taking students with an ATAR of 30. For those not familiar with ATAR, basically you get a mark from 0 to 99.95, so a mark of 30 means you perform better than 30% of the population, but worse than 70%. Now, there's no way I could have gotten into university with a score that low 25 years ago. So there are people going to university that probably shouldn't be because government policy is obsessed with getting everyone a college education for some reason, even if it's useless. And of course, more students means more money. But there is the obvious question of, what are you studying? I think it was Milo that made the point that students studying gender studies are actually coming out of university dumber than when they went in. Jordan Peterson made the claim that universities are now possibly doing more harm than good outside the hard sciences, where incidentally you'll find most women. It's hard to write about this without sounding like you believe young women must place finding a husband above forging a successful career. I don't. Or if you believe more men should be admitted to university at the expense of women to plug the husband gap. I don't. Well, of course not. Or that marrying someone with a lower level of education is a terrible thing. I don't believe that either. But as the business journalist John Berger relates in his book Datonomics, if an educated woman wants to form a long-term partnership with a man of similar education, the numbers are stacked against her. Yeah, this is not exactly a mind-blowing revelation. I mean, if you're a male gamer and you don't want to date anyone who isn't a gamer, then as a male, your options are going to be limited. Simple math. Why don't you ladies stop objectifying men based on their education? Anyway, this doesn't really square with what Pew Research found a few years back and that I reported on in a video last year, that education levels are ranked about the same for those that had never married in determining what's important to them. The big discrepancy was whether you had a steady job. Women ranked that aspect significantly higher than men did. Also, another notable difference was the reversal between the number of men and women that thought a successful marriage is one of the most important things in their lives. 20 years ago, more men thought it was important. Now, significantly more women do. Kat, who works in social media and graduated last year, says of her group of female friends, only one of them has a boyfriend. And the others are all really attractive, fun girls, clever, educated, and can't find a boyfriend. It's really odd. Yeah, look, I'm really surprised that it took 3 paragraphs to get to this point. Every time there's an article like this, the claim is always the same, that the women are basically perfect and that they can't comprehend how guys wouldn't want to date these fun, smart, attractive women. Of course, this is all just asserted. You're going to say nice things about your friends, but the reality is that some of your friends probably aren't that attractive, and the things that you think make them attractive, men actually don't find attractive. She thinks it has a lot to do with dating apps such as Tinder, where everyone's thinking there's something better around the corner, but it could be just a numbers game, she says. Maybe because there's more choice of girls than there ever was. It's more difficult to find a guy because the pool is smaller. Well, that only makes sense if you confine who you will and won't date to education, but we know that's just not the case. That's not the only determinant of whether someone will date someone else. And one of those factors that's not being talked about here is what Coltane calls the gender attraction differential.
Our chart shows how men have rated women on a scale from 0 to 5. The curve is symmetric and surprisingly charitable. A woman is as likely to be considered extremely ugly as extremely beautiful, and the majority of women have been rated about medium. The chart looks normalised even though it is just the unfiltered opinion of our male users, end quote. Now, essentially what this is saying is that the so-called male appraisals of female attractiveness, that is, the raw opinions of males towards the opposite sex on OkCupid, are fairly well balanced. Even by mathematical standards, the mean and median both seem to sit around 50%, with a fairly wide standard deviation. The male user base of OkCupid seem to have a fairly reasonable perspective of the opposite sex. However, as we get further into the article, specifically the section where the female user base is assessed in the same way, we see some very, very different things. Quote, "As you can see from the grey line, women rate an incredible 80% of guys as worse looking than medium. Very harsh," end quote. Now, this data from OkCupid is corroborated by other sources. Tinder, for example, also shows a very clear gender differential, with women swiping right only 15% of the time versus men swiping right 47% of the time. I actually find this fact particularly interesting, that on a platform like Tinder, which rates and judges individuals purely on the basis of looks, we see such a wide gender disparity in male versus female appraisal of attractiveness. Given that we're constantly told that women are the ones who have to live up to an unrealistic standard of beauty. But the inability of feminists to review real-world data in the face of their facile ideology is really a discussion for another video.
So women are more harsh judges of attractiveness, and this is understandable from an evolutionary point of view. A woman produces about 400 fertile eggs in her lifetime. Men can fertilise thousands of eggs easily, so women are generally more selective. The educational level just adds another layer to the selectivity. Berger had started noticing that he was around far more single women than men. It struck me as odd because the women seemed to have a lot more going for them than some of the men he knew in relationships, which is my way of saying they were better looking and better company. Well, first, your personal anecdote doesn't constitute a valid data set. And second, why would you think that your criteria, better looking and better company, and which are obviously highly subjective, would lead you to a valid conclusion? I mean, according to Pew, if a man had a steady job, that's pretty important. A guy with a good job, which generally means good pay, will make him significantly more dateable. This was also true of my own circle of friends outside of work. I knew a lot of single women, and my wife and I used to try to play matchmaker. But it got to a point where we didn't know any single men anymore. And now here's the big reveal. Across young people aged 30 and under, there are about 4 college grad women for every 3 college grad men. In many cases, this gender gap is even bigger in rural states than in urban ones. It's not just the US, it's most Western countries, whether it's Italy, the UK or Australia. But again, this doesn't jibe with his description. He made it sound like there are fields of single women and no single men around. If the ratio is 3 college-educated men to every 4 women, then that would be barely noticeable. I think the problem here is that his sample set is off, or he's just bullshitting for the purposes of his narrative. In the vernacular of the best-selling dating manuals, it's not that he's just not into you, writes Berger, it's that there aren't enough of him. In the US, his book has been greeted with relief. Women have told him it's a comfort to know there's nothing wrong with them, just that they've fallen victim to the numbers. Well, isn't that convenient? I never have to look at myself. Well, I'm not going to let you off the hook as easily as you're willing to let yourselves off, ladies. I know you've been told from birth and reinforced throughout life that you're all wonderful, but you might want to entertain the possibility that, like everyone, you might need to do a little work on yourself. For educated women who refuse to date non-educated men, it creates two problems, says Berger. It creates a statistical challenge because they are voluntarily limiting themselves to a dating pool that has 4 women for every 3 men, but it also gives way too much leverage to those college-educated men, and I think it encourages those men to be overly choosy and to delay settling down. This kind of classism doesn't penalise the men because the supply of educated women is so large. Oh no, you mean men might have the upper hand in the educated singles market? But how about the attraction differential? I mean, the problem here is that the analysis is just one-dimensional. It's just a straight numbers game. Anything outside education isn't even considered. Robin Dunbar, Professor of Evolutionary Psychology at Oxford University, says women looking for equally educated male partners will be forced to compete, I guess, and those that lose will have to downgrade their expectations and are likely to marry later as a result. And that's basically the conclusion I came to in my video on the topic. Either women will have to downgrade expectations in terms of education, or less people will get married. Now, the article does mention the plight of working-class men. This isn't just an issue for educated women, though the focus has been on them. Women's romantic choices are always analysed, of course, yes, by other women, with a skew towards the scaremongering. I doubt anybody was too worried about men's prospects when male graduates outnumbered females. If there are more graduate women than men, who are those men with lower levels of education dating if the educated women won't consider them? In hindsight, I almost wish I had made this a bigger part of the book, says Berger. Well, of course you didn't make it a bigger part of your book because you know who your audience is, in the same way the marketers of 50 Shades of Rape knew who their audience was. But this is the interesting part of the Pew analysis that I showed in my previous video. 50 years ago, educated women paid a price for that education in the marriage market. Women who had a high school education only were much more likely to get married. However, that has changed significantly. Educated women are getting married at approximately the same rate as high school educated women. And if the trend continues, it will be non-college educated women that will lose out, if you consider not being married losing out. But as usual, the women that write these types of articles are interested in the plight of women like themselves, just as feminists are interested in securing jobs in politics, STEM fields, and boardrooms for women like themselves. Anyway, the problem with this article is that it only considers one aspect of what makes people attractive to the opposite sex. There is some evidence in the article that some women are happy to marry someone with lower educational qualifications, probably because they possess some other attribute that makes up for it, like a decent paying job. So will this educational deficit result in suburbs of cat ladies and cat men, or will we adapt to the new realities? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time.